December 1944. The Third Reich was crumbling. But Adolf Hitler had one last card to play. He gathered his last reserves, the 6th Panzer Army, led by the fanatical SS, and the 5th Panzer Army. He equipped them with the heaviest, most terrifying tanks ever built, the Tiger II, or King Tiger, and the Panther. His plan, Operation Wattam Rhine, the Battle of the Bulge, was to smash through the thin American lines in the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. Hitler was confident. He believed the American army was soft. He believed they were a mongrel force that would break under the pressure of a concentrated armored assault. German intelligence briefed the panzer commanders on the American equipment. They dismissed the M for Sherman as a Tommy Cooker, a tank that burned easily and couldn't penetrate German armor. But they were particularly dismissive of the American tank destroyers. The Germans saw vehicles like the M10 Wolverine and the early M18S. They saw open tops. They saw thin armor. They saw vehicles that looked like they had been built on the cheap. They are suicide jockeys, the German officers joked. They drive convertibles into battle. Hitler believed that his heavy panzers, impervious to most Allied guns from the front, would simply roll over these light American vehicles. He envisioned a repeat of 1940, a blitzkrieg that would shatter the enemy line and send the Americans running in panic. He was counting on the weather, fog and snow, to ground the Allied air force. Without their planes, Hitler reasoned, the Americans would have to fight tank to tank. And in a tank-to-tank fight, the King Tiger was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The German offensive launched on December 16. The surprise was total. The American front collapsed. The panzers rolled forward, crushing opposition. But deep in the snowy forests, the suicide jockeys were waiting. And they weren't planning to run. They were planning to hunt. To understand why the Germans underestimated the American defense, you have to understand the strange philosophy of the US Army, the tank destroyer doctrine. Before the war, General Leslie McNair had decided that fighting enemy tanks with your own tanks was inefficient. He believed that American tanks, Shermans, should support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. Enemy tanks, he argued, should be fought by specialists. These specialists were the tank destroyer, TD, battalions. The doctrine stated that tanks should not be spread out along the front line. Instead, the TDS should be held in reserve. They were the Fire Brigade. When the Germans attacked with a mass of armor, the TDS would rush to the point of the breakthrough. They would set up ambushes. They would shoot the German tanks, break the attack, and then move to the next crisis. To do this, the TD vehicles were designed differently from tanks. They sacrificed armor for speed and firepower. They had open-top turrets to save weight and give the commander better visibility to spot the enemy first. The Germans thought this was madness. They believed a fighting vehicle should be a fortress. They couldn't comprehend a doctrine that deliberately sent lightly armored vehicles to fight heavy tanks. They viewed the open top as a fatal flaw, a bucket to catch grenades and shrapnel, which it often was. But the Americans relied on the principle of see first, shoot first. The doctrine was controversial. Many American commanders hated it. They wanted better tanks, not specialized destroyers. But in the winter of 1944, as the German panzers poured through the Ardennes, the doctrine was put to the ultimate test. The fire brigades were called into action. They were thrown into the path of the German steamroller. The German commanders expected to brush them aside. They were about to find out that a thin-skinned vehicle with a big gun is actually a very dangerous thing to ignore. The backbone of the American tank destroyer force in 1944 was the M10 Wolverine. It was based on the chassis of the Sherman tank, but it looked sharper, more angular. Its armor was sloped to deflect shells, but it was thin, about half the thickness of a Sherman. Its main weapon was the 3-inch, 76.2 mm M7 gun. In 1942, this gun was powerful. By late 1944, against the front of a Panther or Tiger, it was struggling. The M10 crews knew they were the underdogs. They lived in a miserable environment. The open turret meant that in the winter, the inside of the tank was as cold as the outside. Snow piled up on the floor plates. The breeches of the guns froze. The crews wore heavy mackinaws and wool caps, shivering as they scanned the tree lines. But the M10 had advantages the Germans missed. It had a powered turret, though slow. It was reliable. And there were a lot of them. When the Battle of the Bulge began, M10 battalions were rushed to the shoulders of the German penetration, places like Elsenborn Ridge. There, they dug in. The M10 crews didn't fight like tank crews. They fought like snipers. They hid their vehicles in barns, in haystacks, and deep in the pine forests. They waited until the German columns passed them. They waited for the side shot. The German panzer crews, buttoned up inside their steel monsters, had poor visibility. The M10 commanders, heads sticking out of the open turrets, saw everything. They saw the exhaust plumes. They heard the tracks. When the Germans attacked the Elsenborn Ridge, they ran into a buzzsaw of M10 fire. The 3-inch guns, firing from concealed positions, hammered the tracks and road wheels of the German tanks. They immobilized the Panthers. Once a Panther was stopped, the M10S would maneuver to the flank and put a shell through the engine. The Germans were furious. They were being stopped by vehicles that they considered inferior. They poured artillery fire onto the M10 positions, exploiting the open tops. The American crews took heavy casualties. But they held the line. The workhorse proved that it wasn't about how thick your armor was, it was about where you placed your gun. While the M10 held the line, a new player entered the game, a nasty surprise that Hitler had not anticipated. The M36 Jackson. The American commanders knew the M10's gun was too weak for the new German Cats. They needed a sledgehammer. They took the M10 chassis and fitted a massive new turret carrying a 90mm M3 gun. This was the American equivalent of the famous German 88. It was a weapon of immense power. It could punch through the front armor of a Tiger I at 1,000 yards. It could kill a Panther at combat ranges. The M36S began arriving in Europe just months before the Battle of the Bulge. When the German panzers rolled forward in December 1944, they expected to face 75mm and 76mm guns, weapons they could shrug off. Instead, they met the 90mm. The shock was profound. German tank commanders would see an American tank destroyer in the distance. They would calculate the range and think, "He cannot hurt me from there." They would continue to advance. Then, the M36 would fire. The 90mm shell didn't bounce. It tore through the German armor plate like paper. Reports from German units began to reflect a new fear. "The Americans have a new Panzerjäger," they radioed. "It kills tigers." The M36 Jackson leveled the playing field. For the first time in the war, the Americans had a gun that could look a king tiger in the eye and win. The arrival of the M36 was a turning point in the psychological war. The German crews lost their sense of invulnerability. They realized that their heavy armor was no longer a guarantee of survival. They had to be careful. They had to be slow. And that slowness doomed the offensive. Hitler's gamble relied on speed. The M36 Jackson became the roadblock that turned the Blitzkrieg into a grinding match of attrition, a match the Germans could not win. The suicide jockeys now had a cannon that could blow the head off the king. The Battle of the Bulge was lost by the Germans not in the deep snow of the Ardennes, but on the first few days, on a piece of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge. This was the northern shoulder of the attack. The plan for the 6th Panzer Army, the SS Fanatics, was to roll over this ridge and race for the Meuse River. They ran into the US 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 644th and 801st Tank Destroyer Battalions. They were equipped with the M10 Wolverine. The Americans knew the Germans were coming. They used the terrain. The infantry dug in. The tank destroyers were placed in hull-down positions along the ridgelines and behind stone walls in the villages of Rochrath and Krinkelt. The crews covered their vehicles in white bedsheets for camouflage. They waited. On the morning of December 17th, the SS Panzers attacked out of the fog. It was a tidal wave of steel, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns. They expected the Americans to run. Instead, the ridge erupted in fire. The M10 gunners, shivering in their open turrets, held their fire until the Germans were close, within 500 yards. Then, the 3-inch guns roared. The leading German tanks were hit instantly. Tracks snapped. Drive sprockets shattered. The German column bunched up, confused by the intensity of the resistance. The M10s, from their concealed positions, picked them apart. They couldn't penetrate the front of the Panthers easily, so they aimed for the gun mantlets, jamming the turrets. They aimed for the tracks. It was a brutal, close-range slugfest. When a German tank tried to flank an infantry position, an M10 would race out of its hiding place, fire a shot into the German side, and reverse back into cover. The Germans poured artillery fire onto the ridge. The open tops of the M10s were a liability. Airbursts rained shrapnel down on the crews. Commanders were killed by snipers. Loaders were wounded by mortar fragments. But the line held. For 3 days, the elite of the SS Panzer Division smashed themselves against the Elsenborn Ridge. They lost dozens of tanks. The delay was fatal to Hitler's timetable. The 6th Panzer Army was supposed to be leading the charge, instead, it was stuck in a meat grinder. The inferior American tank destroyers, fighting in close cooperation with the infantry, had stopped the Blitzkrieg cold on the very first step. The defining characteristic of the American tank destroyer was the open top. It was designed to give the crew a tactical advantage, visibility. The commander could stand up, see over hedgerows, and spot the enemy before they spotted him. And in the summer in France, it worked reasonably well. But in the winter of 1944–45, in the Ardennes, the open top was a torture device. It was the coldest winter in decades. Temperatures dropped below zero. The inside of an M10 or M36 was not a shelter. It was just a steel box filled with frozen air. Snow would fall directly into the turret. It would melt on the warm engine firewall and then refreeze into ice on the floor plates. The crews were miserable. They wore every piece of clothing they owned: long underwear, wool shirts, sweaters, heavy Mackinaw coats, wool caps under their helmets. They wrapped burlap sacks around their boots to try and keep their feet from freezing. Touching the frozen steel of the gun breech with bare skin could peel the flesh right off. But the cold was only part of the nightmare. The Germans quickly realized the vulnerability of the open top. If they couldn't kill the M10 with a tank shell, they would kill the crew with artillery. They used tree bursts. An artillery shell fired with a time fuse would explode high in the pine trees above the American positions. The explosion sent thousands of razor-sharp steel fragments and wood splinters raining straight down. For an infantryman in a foxhole, this was bad. For a tank destroyer crew in an open steel box, it was devastating. There was nowhere to hide. Crews would try to cover the turrets with tarps or improvise armored roofs from scrap metal, but it was never enough. Casualties among TD crews were appallingly high. Loaders were decapitated while reaching for shells. Commanders were riddled with shrapnel while looking through their binoculars. The inside of the turrets became gruesome scenes. And yet, the crews kept fighting. They fought numb with cold and terrified of the sky. They knew that their open top was a death sentence if the artillery found them, but they also knew that it was the only reason they could see the German Panthers sneaking through the trees. It was a brutal trade-off that defined the tank destroyer experience. The German Tiger II, the King Tiger, was the monster of the battlefield. 70 tons of steel. A massive 88mm gun. Frontal armor that was virtually impervious to almost every Allied weapon. German crews inside the King Tigers felt like gods. They could sit on a hill at 2,000 yards and pick off Shermans with impunity. They had supreme confidence in their invulnerability. And then they met the M36 Jackson. The first encounters were a shock that rippled through the entire Panzerwaffe. A column of King Tigers would be advancing down a road, crushing everything in its path. Suddenly, there would be a massive crack, louder than a typical anti-tank gun. The lead Tiger would stop violently. A neat hole would appear in its thick frontal glacis plate. Smoke would pour from the hatches. The German crews in the other tanks would be stunned. What was that? Nothing can penetrate a Tiger from the front. They would scan the distance and see the low silhouette of an American vehicle. It looked like another one of those weak M10s. But it wasn't. It was an M36 with the 90mm gun. The 90mm M3 gun firing an armor-piercing capped APC shell could punch through the turret front of a King Tiger at combat ranges. If the American crews had the rare high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP tungsten rounds, they could kill it from even farther away. The German sense of security evaporated. Reports went back to headquarters: the enemy has a new weapon. Tigers are being destroyed frontally. The psychological impact was immense. The King Tiger crews, who had been aggressive, suddenly became cautious. They stopped moving down roads. They started moving cross-country, which was slow and caused mechanical breakdowns. They had to treat the open ground as a danger zone. The M36 crews became giant killers. They actively hunted the heaviest German tanks. They would set up ambushes, waiting patiently for the big cats to reveal themselves. They knew they only had one shot. If they missed, or if the shell bounced, the Tiger's 88mm would destroy them instantly. It was a high-stakes duel. But for the first time, the Americans had a gun that could win that duel. The king had been dethroned by a suicide jockey in a convertible with a very big gun. The siege of Bastogne is famous for the stand of the 101st Airborne paratroopers. Nuts, and all that glory. But the paratroopers couldn't fight tanks with rifles. The city was held because it was defended by a combined arms team. And the backbone of the anti-tank defense was the tank destroyers. Elements of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the fast M18 Hellcat, and others were trapped inside the perimeter. They were used exactly as the doctrine intended, as a mobile fire brigade. Bastogne was surrounded. The Germans attacked from every direction, north, south, east, west. Whenever the Germans threatened to break through the thin paratrooper lines with tanks, the call went out for the TDS. Teams of M18s or M10s would race to the threatened sector. It was chaotic, confusing urban and forest combat in the fog and snow. The TDS would arrive just as German Panzer IVs or Panthers were overrunning the infantry foxholes. The fighting was at point-blank range. In one famous incident at the village of Neuville, a team of TDS and Shermans commanded by Major William Desabry held off an entire German armored division for 2 days. They fought until their vehicles were destroyed, then fell back to Bastogne. Inside the city, the TDS were constantly on the move. They were the glue that held the defense together. They would shoot a German tank, reverse, speed down a side street, and appear on the flank of another attack. Their mobility and firepower allowed the American commander, General McAuliffe, to plug the gaps in his line. Without the tank destroyers, the German armor would have overrun the paratroopers in the first few days. The paratroopers loved the TD crews. They were the big brothers who showed up when the bullies arrived. They shared their foxholes, their food, and their fate. The defense of Bastogne was a triumph of the fire brigade concept. It proved that a small, mobile, hard-hitting force could defeat a much larger, heavier enemy by being in the right place at the right time. While the King Tiger was a rare beast, the Panther was the backbone of the German offensive. It was fast, had a lethal gun, and its frontal armor was sloped so effectively that standard Allied shells bounced off it like pebbles. But the German engineers had made a fatal compromise to save weight. They made the side armor thin. Very thin. The side of a Panther was only 40 to 50 millimeters thick, and it was vertical, not sloped. American tank destroyer crews were taught to memorize this weakness. "Don't shoot the face," the sergeants yelled. "Shoot the ribs." The M10 Wolverines, often outgunned in a frontal duel, became masters of the flank. They used the terrain of the Ardennes, the winding roads, the dense forests, to set up L-shaped ambushes. A team of TDS would let the lead German tanks pass. Then, they would open fire from the side. The 3-inch gun of the M10, which struggled against the Panther's front, could slice through the side armor like butter. German tank crews sat on top of panniers filled with ammunition stored along the sides of the hull. A single penetration from the flank usually detonated the ammo. The Panther, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had a glass jaw, but you had to hit it from the right angle. The tank destroyer doctrine of mobility allowed the Americans to get to that angle. While the German columns were road-bound and sluggish, the TDS were moving through the woods, hunting for the perfect side shot. It was a lesson in geometry. The Germans had built a shield that only covered the front. The Americans simply walked around it. January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was winding down, but Hitler wasn't done. He launched Operation Nordwind, a massive offensive in the Alsace region against the US 7th Army. This wasn't fought in forests, it was fought in towns. Rittershofen. Hatton. It was a brutal, close-quarters urban nightmare. The M36 Jacksons were thrown into the streets. This was the worst possible environment for an open-topped vehicle. Snipers were in every window. Molotov cocktails rained down from roofs. But the M36 had a solution, the 90mm gun. The American crews used their massive cannons to dismantle the towns themselves. If a German tank was hiding behind a house, the M36 wouldn't drive around the corner. It would shoot through the house. The 90mm armor-piercing shell would smash through 2 brick walls and still have enough energy to kill the German tank on the other side. Or they would use high-explosive shells to collapse the building on top of the enemy armor. The violence was absolute. German SS Panzer units, equipped with flamethrower tanks, tried to burn the Americans out. The M36 crews fought back with a ferocity that stunned the SS. They held their ground in burning villages, their open turrets filled with smoke and snow, firing round after round until the German assault broke. Nordwind was stopped not by strategic maneuvering, but by the sheer, stubborn firepower of the tank destroyers holding the line in the rubble. As the winter wore on, the American crews received a secret weapon that changed the physics of the battlefield. HVAP ammunition. High-velocity armor-piercing. The crews called it the silver bullet. Instead of a heavy steel slug, the HVAP round had a lightweight aluminum body wrapped around a core of ultra-hard tungsten carbide. Because it was lighter, it flew faster, up to 3,400 feet per second. Velocity is the key to penetration. When an HVAP round hit a German tank, it didn't shatter. The tungsten core punched through the thickest steel like a diamond drill. With HVAP, even the older M10S could penetrate the front of a Tiger I at close range. And the M36 Jackson? With HVAP, it could kill a King Tiger from a mile away. The supply of these shells was limited. Tungsten was a rare strategic metal, so crews hoarded them. They saved them for the big cats. When a German Tiger commander saw an American destroyer, he usually calculated that he was safe as long as he kept his front armor pointed at the enemy. The HVAP round ruined that calculation. Suddenly, that impenetrable German armor was failing. German morale plummeted. They realized the technological gap was closing. The Americans didn't just have more tanks, they now had bullets that could ignore the German armor advantage. That silver bullet was the final nail in the coffin of the heavy tank doctrine. Armor couldn't keep up with the speed of tungsten. When the war ended, the US Army eventually abandoned the tank destroyer doctrine. They realized that the main battle tank, like the M26 Pershing and later M48 Patton, could do both jobs, support infantry and kill tanks. But in the winter of 1944–45, the doctrine worked. It worked because of the men who executed it. The crews of the tank destroyer battalions, the 704th, the 644th, the 823rd, had stopped the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. They had faced the King Tigers and the Panthers in vehicles that were essentially open buckets of thin steel. And they had won. They won because they were faster. They won because they were aggressive. And they won because they had the big guns when nobody else did. The final shot of the documentary shows a column of defeated German prisoners marching past a parked M36 Jackson. The German tankers, stripped of their black uniforms, look up at the massive 90mm barrel looming over them. There is fear in their eyes, and respect. They had dismissed the suicide jockeys. They had laughed at the open tops. But in the end, the heavy German tanks were left rusting in the snow, while the American destroyers rolled onto the Rhine. The gamble had failed. The fire brigade had put out the fire. And the tank destroyer, a weapon built for a specific moment in history, had saved the Allied armies from disaster.